Hello, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Thompson, and I would like to read another story to you today from Ethel Barrett Tells Favorite Bible Stories. And this one is found in the last 9 chapters of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. It's called You Shouldn't Quarrel, but if you do. Do you have brothers and sisters? How do you get along with them? Are you always kind? Or do you fight and quarrel sometimes? Mom gave you the biggest piece. She did not. Yes, she did too. Well, I'm smarter than you are. You are not. I am so. You're bragging. I am not. Are too. Mom, he's bragging. I am not. You are. You're a brag. You're a brag. I think you're a great big drag. Wait a minute. I want to tell you a story about a boy who lived way back in Bible times. His name was Joseph, and he did have a lot of brothers. He had 10 big brothers and 1 baby brother. And when they all sat around the breakfast table and passed the barley cakes and honey, believe me, it was pretty noisy. Joseph's father was very rich. He had sheep and goats and donkeys and camels, more of them than you could count. And Joseph helped his father and his brothers watch the sheep and the cattle. And he hunted and he rode the donkeys and sometimes stopped to tickle his baby brother's feet. But he never tickled his older brother's feet. In fact, there was nothing about Joseph that tickled his older brothers. And did they quarrel? They quarreled about a lot of things. There was the time Joseph's father gave him a beautiful coat. And when Joseph scampered off to show the coat to his brothers, they didn't think it was beautiful. They scowled and scuffed the ground with their feet and they mumbled. They were angry. They were jealous. And then there was the time that Joseph had those dreams. Did they ever quarrel over them? Whew. You know what? Joseph said, I had the most amazing dream last night. And he reached for the barley cakes. In my dream, we were all tying up grain in bundles, and my bundle stood up straight. But your bundles, may I have some honey? Your bundles and our bundles, his brothers grumbled. What did our bundles do? Joseph dove into another barley cake. Your bundles, he said, bowed down to my bundle. Whew, did that ever start a quarrel? Do you think you're going to be a king or something? They bellowed, and rule over us? And they tackled their barley cakes with howls and growls. Well, sir, that dream was bad enough. But when the second dream came along, oh my. I had another dream, Joseph said. Wait till you hear this one. This time it was stars. Stars? They all stopped chewing their barley cakes and stared at him. Yep, stars, he said happily. 11 of them. And that's not all. The sun bowed down to me, and the moon too. Well, this time, even Joseph's father thought this was a bit much. He shot Joseph one of those enough looks. Come, Joseph, he said. If the 11 stars are supposed to be your brothers, Joseph shrugged. Then the sun and the moon are supposed to be your father and mother, so your father and mother are going to bow down to you too? Well, if you think we're going to bow down to you, his brother scoffed, forget it. No way. They were very angry. After that, things didn't go well. They didn't go well at all. Here comes that dreamer, Joseph's brothers would say when they saw him coming, and there goes the dreamer, they'd say when he walked away. And then the day came when Joseph probably wished he had stuck to eating his barley cakes instead of telling his brothers about those dreams. For something dreadful happened. It happened because Joseph's brothers were far away where they'd gone to find pasture for their sheep, and Joseph's father sent him to go see if they were all right. And Joseph put on the beautiful coat his father had given him and started on the long, long trek to find his brothers. He didn't know it, but when he found them, something was going to happen that would change his whole life. When his brothers saw him coming in the distance, the first thing they saw were the beautiful colors in that coat. And all their old jealousy came back over them like a tidal wave. "Well, if it isn't the dreamer," they said. And when they thought about those dreams, they got angry all over again. "Let's throw him in that pit," they said, "and forget him." And they watched him coming closer. "Hi, guys. Father sent me," Joseph started, and that was as far as he got. They grabbed him, and they tore off his coat, and they dragged him over to the pit, and they pushed him in. "Ah!" thought Joseph. "Anything could happen now." And something did. Joseph's brothers got an idea that changed Joseph's whole life. It happened when the brothers saw something coming way off in the distance. First, it was just a speck. But as it came closer, they saw that it was a caravan of merchants with camels and donkeys loaded with goods to sell in Egypt. "Let's sell Joseph," they said, "and we'll never have to see him again." Now the caravan was close enough to hear the camel bells. Then it came to a halt, and the bells stopped ringing. "Want to buy a boy?" the brothers called out. And down in his pit, Joseph went, "Oh." "He'll make a good slave," they said. And some of them reached down and pulled Joseph out of the pit. "We sure do," the merchants called back. And Joseph went, "Oh." "Come along, boy," the merchant said, pulling him toward the caravan. And Joseph thought, "Help." But it was no use. Joseph was dragged off to Egypt, far, far away. His brothers had sold him as if he were a bundle of grain or a batch of barley cakes. And then they went home and told their father that Joseph was dead. That's the end of the dreamer, they thought. But was it? Let's see what happened. Joseph was sold as a slave to a man named Potiphar, and then went to live in his beautiful house, and then things began to happen. First, Joseph was so good and so honest that Potiphar made him master over all the slaves in his house. That was good. Oh, joy. But then Potiphar's wife told Potiphar that Joseph had done something very wicked, and Potiphar put Joseph in prison. And that was very bad. Oh, gloom. But then, while he was in prison, he met another prisoner who was the butler to the great Pharaoh of Egypt. And this prisoner had a strange dream and told Joseph about it. And Joseph told him what the dream meant. And it meant, of all things, that the butler would be free from prison. And it happened just as Joseph said it would. And the butler promised Joseph that he would ask the king to let Joseph out of prison. Oh, joy! But then the months went by, and then 2 whole years went by, and nothing happened. The butler had forgotten his promise. Oh, gloom. But then the king had a dream, and nobody could tell him what it meant. And then the butler remembered his dream, and he also remembered his promise. And he told the king that Joseph could tell him what his dream meant, and the king sent for Joseph to come to the palace. Oh, joy! And Joseph did tell the king what his dream meant. It meant that in a few years there would be a famine in the land because nothing would grow and the people wouldn't have any food, and that they had better store up food now so they'd have enough when it happened. And the king told Joseph that he could be, was it joy or gloom? Well, we'll find out in just a minute. In the meantime, the famine came as Joseph had said it would. And it was all over the land. It was even back where Joseph's brothers and his father lived. The ground dried up. Nothing would grow. The cattle had no grass to eat, and the people had no food. "Whatever shall we do?" Joseph's brothers cried. "There's only one thing we can do," said Joseph's father. "You will have to go to Egypt and buy some grain. In Egypt, they've been storing up grain for years. They have great storehouses and barns loaded with grain. I'll stay home with your youngest brother." So Joseph's brothers took donkeys and made the long trek to Egypt. And when they got there, they got to one of the huge storehouses. Who was selling the grain but the head man, the great Egyptian ruler next to the king himself? They all bowed down before him. And did he ever look stern? And were they ever scared? And he gave them a hard time, too. You are spies, he said, and he had them all put in prison. And then he told them they could all go home if they left one of the brothers behind. Oh, he was stern. He asked them a lot of questions. They told him that they had an old father and a younger brother at home. And then he told them they better come back with the youngest brother, or else. Well, they went home in fear and trembling and got their youngest brother and went back to Egypt again, more frightened than ever. And oh, did they ever have their ups and downs. First, the second head man next to the king himself asked them all about their family. And then he let them go home. And then he made them come back. And then he invited them to his palace for dinner. And then he let him go home again. And then he made them come back. He seemed to change his mind every time they turned around. They didn't know whether they were coming or going. Then he invited them back to his palace again, and they all bowed down before him. And then, look at me, said the great ruler of Egypt next to the king. They stared at him, trembling. Don't you know me? He said. They didn't know how to answer. Whatever was he up to now? Then they saw that he had tears in his eyes. He looked back at them, eyeball to eyeball. I am your brother, Joseph. What? This was Joseph? Oh my. Their brother whom they had sold as a slave? Yes, indeed it was. For that was what the king had told Joseph he could be. He had told Joseph that he could be the chief ruler of Egypt next to the king himself. Now, Joseph could have said to his brothers, you quarreled with me, and you bullied me, and you sold me as a slave, and now it's my turn to get even. Do you suppose he did? Do you suppose he did? No. Instead, he forgave them. Don't be afraid of me, he said, and don't even be sorry you sold me. God has made me chief ruler of Egypt next to the king himself, so I could provide you with food. And then he hugged them, and the tears ran down his face and splashed on their heads. Oh, joy! It was almost too good to believe. And they laughed and cried and thanked God that they were all safe. And they sent for their old father, who thought he would never see Joseph again. And they all lived in Egypt all together again. Boys and girls, let me ask you, do you have ups and downs? Do you have joy and then gloom? Do you have brothers and sisters? How do you get along with them? Are you always kind? Or do you quarrel and fight sometimes? If you do you forgive each other? If you remember to love God and you know that He is with you, you can be kind and forgiving just like Joseph. A very good Bible verse to learn, maybe you already know it, Ephesians 4:32. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, hath forgiven you. Let's talk to God. Dear God, thank you for taking care of us as you did Joseph. Help us to be kind to our family and our friends. And if others do something to us that we don't like, help us to forgive them. In Jesus' name, amen.